Hello, everyone. My name's YiFeng. Welcome to Watching Silent Films. And with me are my co-hosts Bob and Lily.
Hello.
Hello.
Greetings. So we just want to welcome everyone, old listeners, returning listeners, new listeners, all sorts of listeners. Doesn't matter who you are. Welcome and thank you for tuning in, as it were, to use an old radio term. The purpose of this podcast, as the name suggests, is that we watch silent films and simply talk about it. So today's feature is Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. It's directed by F.W. Murnau, and it's this incredible masterpiece of not just silent movies, but movies of all history, of all time. So before we get there, there's a few things we want to get to kind of on this podcast, and then we'll kind of dive in towards the end and kind of wrap up at the end. So today's sort of structure, as it were, will be we're going to kind of reintroduce Bob a little bit. I felt like we were in a rush last week. When I said 5 seconds, he literally gave me the 5-second intro. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then after that we'll talk about a little bit about the mission, vision, and what we're intending to do with watching silent films, and also if we have that time to check out what we've seen lately in the classic realm, and then kind of dive right into the feature, which is the review of Nosferatu from all of us here. So let me reintroduce Bob. Last week he joined us for Haxon. Is that how it's pronounced? I can't remember now.
It looked like Haxon to me, yeah.
Yeah, was it pronounced some
I didn't see any
Swedish or a Dutch word pronunciation? But anyways, during the introduction, again, I said 5 seconds. I meant to say, give a more than 5 seconds. Maybe a 5 minute, maybe a 15-minute, whatever.
Wow.
Whatever makes more sense of a proper introduction, I think.
Because my life story.
Yeah, well, I mean, after we paused the podcast, you kind of talked about those backgrounds about how you got into movies. And I was like, that should have been in the podcast. So let's do that now. So let me re-ask the question. So welcome, Bob, once again for joining us on this merry adventure of watching silent films. And the first thing is just, how did you get into movies? I know you talked very briefly last week, but give us kind of the whole spiel about how you really got into movies in general, not just silent films. Okay. And then maybe towards the end say, how did you, what are some of your sort of big sort of the silent films that you like or you've known about or you're interested in?
Okay. Well, let's see. I've liked movies since I was very young. Pretty much a young boy, I started watching movies. It was a family tradition in my immediate family to sit down for The Wonderful World of Disney. And we'd see movies like Ben the Friendly Bear, and things like Don Knotts in The Apple Dumpling Gang with Tim Conway.
Those
Disney.
were on TV, right? When you talk
those
about...
Those were TV movies.
Okay, just checking.
A Wonderful World of Disney, yeah. It was... Then, that was when I was very young. That's, single digits. And then, my grandmother and my mom and I would watch movies at home. And we would also go out to the movies occasionally. But we'd watch movies at home. My grandmother had very interesting taste. She liked... One of her favorite films was The 400 Blows, which I believe starred Topo. And it was a very serious black and white drama.
Was that the French movie?
Yes.
François Truffaut?
I think so, yes.
It's about the kid wandering in Paris, right? Kind of doing hoodlum stuff. 400 Blows?
Well, it was about the relationship between a father-son. The father was struggling, and very, very heavy drama. But anyway.
Yeah, I love that movie. If it's the same movie we're talking about, 400 Blows. It was serious. Truffaut's first movie that he made after he was he was initially a film critic, sort of like Roger Ebert was. It's really interesting. There's a handful of critics that became filmmakers during the French New Wave, of which Truffaut was one of them.
Right.
So Truffaut and what's his name? The guy who made Breathless? Jean-Luc Godard. So
those
guys and maybe a few others they are all part of the French New Wave in the 60s and 70s. Yep. And they were like film critics, like Roger Ebert type. And then like they wrote about movies, reviewed movies, and then they made movies, which is very unusual. I don't think we see that nowadays, but go on, sorry. Side note.
So let's see, there were movies like, my grandmother showed me films like The Third Man, and she loved Hitchcock, and so movies like, well, all the Hitchcock, you can go on and on, but anyway, that was probably when I was about 12. I was starting to really like sophisticated movies that a 12-year-old wouldn't be normally watching because of my grandmother. Then I was 13 years old, and I had a real love for Alec Guinness, The Man in the White Suit and The Lady Killers, and I love all of his movies. And then Star Wars came out, and I remember a pamphlet, a magazine that came out in junior high school, which gave a little movie review and showed some pictures of the movie. And I had no interest in Star Wars whatsoever. It looked hokey to me, a couple guys in robot suits, and it looked really corny. And so I went over to my grandmother's house. My aunt was living with her at the time. This was my youngest aunt, who's only about 7, 8 years older than me, and I thought she was the coolest thing in the world. And anyway, she said, "Have you seen Star Wars?" And I said, "Nah, I'm not interested in Star Wars." And she says, "What? You've got to see Star Wars, And I said, "Why? Why should I want to see that movie?" And she says, "Alec Guinness is in it." I went, "Really?" and I immediately had to go out and see it. And fell in love with it. Saw it 3 times in one day at the theater. And I actually recorded Star Wars on my Walkman. It's a, I don't know if I have to explain what a Walkman is, but it's a tape recording I made by bringing my tape recorder into the theater.
I think you might have to, the way the people are listening nowadays.
Yeah. And I brought my tape recorder into the theater with me and recorded the movie. I put it on the seat next to me and recorded the movie, and literally listened to the movie over and over all day long in my head, the audio of it. And so I was a huge Star Wars fan. But even at 13 years old, when Star Wars was out, I was still watching movies like 12 Angry Men and Failsafe. These are some of my favorite movies. And those are really serious movies. Not silent films, but... So anyway, I kept watching movies. In fact, I got a job working for Blockbuster Video as a theater manager. As a store manager. And I would take home 3 movies every day and watch them. And I got from a friend who worked at Blockbuster with me, I got a black box, because cable was still relatively new, and they didn't have securities to stop you. And so I got a black box, which basically unscrambled all the channels. And so I started to record everything. And I I started to have this collection of about 200 to 300 video cassettes, VHS cassettes, and said, okay, I can't keep doing this because I'm going to fill my room with video cassettes. So I started to be very selective, and I said, okay, I'm going to have 50. I'm going to limit myself to 50 movies, and every time I find one that's better, I'm going to toss out an old one. So that was a fun hobby, So when I got into college, I went to Boston College, and I decided at that point I really like to know if I could make a list of all the movies I had ever seen, and I started to compile a list, and I was just putting movies constantly. I got up to about 1,600 movies, and that was back in the mid-'80s. And I said, okay. And then as things do, it passed. The interest in keeping that going sort of passed. And then technology advanced, and the computer system I was using when I did that was on a floppy disk, 3 by 5 inch floppy disk. Technology advanced, and then the disk was no longer readable and got lost. So I lost that collection of films that I had seen. And then about 15, 20 years later, I decided to do it again. And I got up to about, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 movies. And said, okay, this is a ridiculous task. And I just stopped doing it. So anyway, yes, I do love movies. My favorites in the silent department would be Chaplin, probably. I love Charlie Chaplin. I mean, I like The Sheik. I like Buster Keaton. But mainly Chaplin as far as silent films goes.
And the comedies are kind of very often the gateway drugs into silent films. and then you get into the harder stuff.
I don't know if it was the first silent film I saw, but it's the one that sticks with me as the one I love best is The Gold Rush.
Oh, yeah.
But I also love The Kid.
Yeah.
So, and I could go on and on with Chaplin. He is my favorite.
Well, we'll get to a lot of them, I think, in time.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's about it.
Wow. Thank you. That was a much better introduction, I feel like, for you rather than just a 5-second thing.
I'm Bob. I like films. I'm here.
There you go. Yeah, I gave a lot of that kind of background on our first podcast. So if you're interested, well, when it's all uploaded, you can kind of rewind and go back and listen to some.
Yeah, you're gonna have to tell me where to find these things now.
It's coming at the time of this recording.
Okay.
So the sort of the mission, vision, or the real reason for creating this in the first place, and also in the first podcast I described this in detail, is that I really wanted to. The whole reason for creating this podcast in the first place is because I couldn't find it. You know, it's the whole necessity is the mother invention type ordeal where I was looking for a podcast myself to listen to because I am a fan of movies like you. You and I have very similar stories. It's just how many movies we watch. We just get into it. And the arena that I was specifically most interested in was in my travels of podcast listening, silent films. So I got deeper and deeper and searched for more and more and asked questions everywhere publicly in the forums. And it didn't seem like there was one. That was, if you search podcast land right now, just the landscape, and you search for TV show rewatch, there's a dozen of those. People are right now rewatching Breaking Bad, Lost, whatever. You name it. They're rewatching it and they're reviewing. They're doing exactly what we're doing now, which is you watch it and they review it. Like they watch an episode and they review it. So that is already pretty much saturated, I would say, if there's such a thing for podcast market, or movies. So they're very often they're theme movies like Hitchcock, and then they review all the Hitchcock movies or. You name it, right? David, there's just all these podcasts out there doing all these themed, topical things. But as far as I was searching back in that time, I couldn't find any podcast specifically devoted to silent films, one, and two, reviewing silent films, like watching and reviewing it. This sort of combination didn't exist. So I was like... Heck, I'll just try and do it myself.
So the field is open for you.
Yeah, so far anyway. So there could be a reason why people aren't doing it, and too. So, but anyway, so that's the whole reason for creating this in the first place. And the second thing is maybe more important is try to bridge some of the gap. Lily and I were talking about briefly earlier was just. Raising awareness of silent films and kind of the restoration efforts that so many organizations, archivists, so the people who keep the film itself, and very often the producers of these old DVDs or Blu-rays of the silent movies, they need to have Kickstarters or GoFundMe or any of those type of sort of venues because. While the film print is okay, in order to get these movies seen by a mass audience, there needs to be some sort of marketing, as it were, for it, and that's essentially it. and it's a very small market, of course. So, anyways, within that market, it's good to kind of promote and push some of that, and so it raises awareness in some of the sort of very, very more sort of not the mainstream stuff. By mainstream silent films, I'm talking about like A Birth of a Nation, or even the thing we're going to talk about today, Nosferatu. These are big titles, of the silent film era. But then you start digging deeper, like Alex Guy Boucher, for example. We were talking about that earlier, a few podcasts ago. A lot of those films aren't available, if at all. And if they are, the print is woefully either not clean, not restored, and nobody's really made an effort to do any of that.
Well, I can appreciate that, because I think that, just to be encouraging to you, the arts are eternal, and people who love the arts will always be there. And they themselves, most of them aren't thinking of taking this on like you are, but I think you can definitely develop a following that will really like it and will appreciate it, especially people in theater who look back to the foundations of theater, film that is, and say, before they connected the sound to it, there was an art there still.
Absolutely. So that's kind of a lot of the mission vision of this particular podcast, is kind of raise awareness just by talking about it. Just being in existence, I think, really is a big step.
Because I think it'd be very popular.
I just think it doesn't really exist right now. So far, it's been kind of me and just a handful. There's probably, if strictly speaking, I think there's probably one other one, but they've only done like 3 episodes. But anyways, so that's kind of the very brief mission vision of, our goal is to raise awareness what silent films are, and if possible, sort of send people towards investing some of those, but also just sort of talk about how to best watch these things. And so in my experience, the best way to watch them is live, in person, not just on the big screen, but with a live performance, accompaniment of these films. Because silent films, more than regular other type of movies where there are soundtracks attached to the film, negatives or CD tracks or whatever, playing back the soundtrack, these silent films are more like musicians performing live performances, and you kind of have to experience it. And I was just listening to another podcast called Nitrateville, and they were talking about Porolone, which is like, I think, in Italy. It's one of the most world's renowned film festivals, especially on silent films. And they'll like trot out a print of whatever that nobody's ever seen, and that's it. That's the only place to see it, because 90%, like 70-90% of all silent films are lost, right? So that's and when they uncover it and they restore it, they'll show it at these film festivals. Anyways, the guy was talking about when he was watching The Kid. We just talked about Charlie Chaplin. He was like, "Yeah, he's seen The Kid like, probably hundreds of times at that point." He was like, well, this film festival has trotted out again. He was going to be like, he was thinking he was get bored. He was like, I guess I have to sit through it one more time. But as he's sitting through the cinema, as the musicians play the soundtrack, which is written by Charlie Chaplin. If you know this, but Charlie Chaplin, when he was exiled post the McCarthy era in America, and he got exiled into Switzerland or something, was when he was living at that time, he ended up writing scores for all of his feature films.
Right. And
then now the estate, basically, Chaplin estate, stipulates that all these movies, when they're shown, has to be using, which makes sense, obviously, he wrote it, so... so when they're using his score, and I'm very intimately familiar with that film, and he watched it live performed on a ginormous screen with audiences, he doesn't get that at home. And even though he's seen it hundreds of times, it's like seeing it for the first time, because that's truly the optimal way to watch silent films, which is hard because we don't have access to that. Nobody's doing that effectively these days. In the areas that we live in, and so the only way that, in terms of accessibility, that we can try to watch some of this is like YouTube, for example, or like other means, right? DVD or some other means,
right?
Which is better, but like sometimes it's just a YouTube, and sometimes on YouTube they don't have the rights to the music or the score, and it's truly silent. And a lot of silent film sort of historians and sort of enthusiasts are like, that's a big no-no. Most silent films have music. Like, there's this desperation of doing all those things that didn't exist, because they didn't really have the means to record it. That's why, they exist. But if you were watching in that era, in the 1910s, teens, 20s, there was usually a musical. It was a live performance. That's the whole experience. Anywho, where was I going? Oh, so that's kind of the point, is that trying to raise this awareness for people that there are these places that you can go see. And so, for example, all the co-hosts and me, we live in the Boston area. And so most recently, I'll point this out just as a FYI, in the Berklee College of Music, they have a silent film department where they get these young kids who are studying film composition, and they have, with this group, written new scores for old silent films. Recently, in May, in the summer, they did one for Joan of the Arc with choral, backgrounds. It was amazing. I just couldn't make it. But they're going to do another one for Phantom of the Opera, I think in Beverly. They're going to do it at the Cabot Theater. So if you Google Beverly Theater and Cabot and look for that showtime, I think I can't remember. It's some Saturday. It's just an astonishing experience to try to go and experience that as a live performance. You know what I mean? So anyways. All right, so that's kind of the goal of this, is to try to raise awareness and get people into it, not just for the sake of getting into it, but rather just to experience some of this, because this type of art is very much a niche art. But then once you experience it, you kind of have a greater appreciation of the struggles of the early filmmakers, but also it makes you appreciate modern films. Like when you watch older movies, you're like, wow, it took them this much effort to make this, and now it's like past it. Like it's like, all these artisans are built on the shoulders of giants, and these were the giants, right? Especially the movie we're going to talk about today.
Right. What they did with the silent film, it would take them, several months to do, would take a day now, because it's almost like we've got it all built in the machinery. So
you can use your phone now to make a movie if you really wanted to.
Right.
So
exactly.
That's kind of the convenience, as it were, that we've come down to. But anyways, the next step is, have you seen anything recently then? Let's start with Bob. Anything in the classic realm? And I usually say that before Star Wars.
2 days ago, I watched Rope by Alfred Hitchcock.
Is that the one with the continuous shot? Or was that the different one?
That is
the one. It was either that, or was it Rear Window? Of those
actually counted the scene breaks.
Yes.
And I believe I saw 2 in the film.
You might
where it actually switches from one scene.
You might want to brief
different...
Lily on what the significance of all that is.
Oh,
or maybe the audience. I don't know.
Rope is an Alfred Hitchcock film starring Jimmy Stewart. It is, the scene, the takes are very, very long. Basically, it only has 7 takes in the whole film.
Wow.
They followed, it all takes place in one apartment. The camera follows the actors around the apartment, goes at different angles, and they do very clever things to do the scene breaks, where someone will pass in front of the camera. They'll literally walk up at a 45-degree angle towards the camera, and they'll turn and they'll be walking away. But while they do that, the film breaks. So all you're seeing is the person's back. They walk up, the film breaks, they're walking away. But the angle of the filming never breaks from one angle to another. So the title Rope is very clever. If you think about a rope, it's continuous. The title is almost symbolic of how it was filmed.
But I think you also have to give a little bit of background on why that there is no ability to have continuous recording. And it's because each film reel is probably maxed out about 10-15 minutes or so. And so
Exactly.
if you physically, like, if you have a 35 millimeter film camera and you hit record, as it were, you know, you start the film reel at a rate of 24 frames a second, and it rolls by real quick. And as you're recording the image, you get about roughly 10-15 minutes of that. And so by the end of that, the recording reel will be done. Like, that's it. There's no more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's different era
Right.
of time of making movies where they only had
Rather
that
than digital
limitation.
recording, right.
And so that's I think the genius behind that specific movie where
Right. No, I don't want to go into a whole review of the film, but there's also the other issue of actors. It's a challenging thing to do a scene that long without stopping.
yeah, it's like
To
theater.
literally,
Yeah.
right, to literally act it out for 15 minutes, you know.
And if somebody messes up, you got to start over again. So.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays, right, if you have digital technology, it's like you don't have that limitation. So you could have all like 2 hours in a single digital medium. So, you know what I mean?
It would still require the actors to do it the way Hitchcock did. You'd still require the actors to do the scenes
Right.
continuously.
Except you're not repeating the 10-15 minute increments, you're repeating the 2 hours. If
Right.
somebody messes up at the last scene.
Hmm.
In fact, there's a new trailer out. This movie is not out yet. I think it's in the Christmas season. It's called 1910. It's by the guy, I can't remember his name. I'm bad with the new director names. But
What did he film recently?
let me look this up right now. I'm going to forget it. It's about World War One, and he did a continuous, or maybe it's 1920, sorry. Maybe I got it wrong. I probably got it wrong. Yes. Yeah, let's keep moving on. I don't remember which one it is, but there's this World War One movie where I think it's Sam Mendes, maybe some other guys, and they filmed a continuous take of the whole movie. I think with this old digital technology, and so I think
1920 movie.
yeah, exactly. And so he's got either there is a cut or there is a cut. I wasn't quite sure yet, but the kind of making of or the behind the scenes seems to indicate that it is a continuous shot of sorts. So, anyways, this is the food for thought. There's something interesting coming out. Speaking of, we're still talking about it, right? Like, even though it's an old technique that Hitchcock was doing with rope in that movie, like, it's still something that people are trying to do even now, like in 2019. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It's so interesting.
It's hard to do for another reason, which is to keep it takes a real talent as a director to keep the dialogue and the drama, to keep the audience's attention in one room with a continuous conversation. The movie Sleuth with Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine was a great example of, again, it wasn't the scene not changing, but it was only basically two actors in the film.
Yeah,
and they were both nominated for Best Actor.
Yep. Yeah, it was Sam Mendes, that is a director who did like American Beauty, and there was he did another one, the gangster one. I call it The Road to Perdition. That's what it's called. And he also did Skyfall. So he's a director of all those movies, and now recently he's gonna do another one called 1917, which will come out in 2019. So yeah, that's the premise. World War One movie of sorts. So I don't know.
So Lily, have you seen any good classics lately?
I was watching some clips from Dracula with Bela Lugosi because of us watching Nosferatu. I didn't get a chance to watch the entire film, But because of that, I did order another vampire-based movie. It's the one with Willem Dafoe and John Malkovich talking about the making of Nosferatu. It came out in 2001.
Yep.
Of course, I can't remember the name.
Yeah,
but
Shadows of the Vampire.
Thank you. Shadows of the Vampire.
Yeah, I saw that in the theaters.
So, just a little bit of the Dracula clips. I don't know, not really related, but I watched a Led Zeppelin cover band last night.
Yeah, absolutely related, yeah. Cool. All right. So, you guys, I don't think I watched anything big recently, except I just saw today that, if you guys pay attention, but there's this artist, Salvador Dali, which is an amazing painter, person, fine arts. He worked with Walt Disney, apparently. They were trying to make this movie called Destino.
Right.
And a 5-minute short that completed their sort of work up to that point.
They did make it.
Well, sort of. I think they just completed it in the last few months or something like that. But anyways, so they started it, and I don't think they quite completed the whole thing until now. But I only saw blips of it. But then the short itself is pretty astonishing. Like, to have an amazing classic painter and meld that with Walt Disney's mind is like, it's crazy. So that's a classic realm stuff. Yeah, check it out if you have time. There's you Google around. There's a 5-minute project called Destino out there, and it's really cool. It's really cool what they did. So it's around the 1950s, and they're trying to collaborate.
I believe I saw it.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on into the feature review of Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horrors. So, we're going to spoil this movie, like many of our movies prior to this, because it's been around for almost 100 years or longer. What was your... First, let's tell the audience what your summary of this story of this movie is. Why don't we start with you, Bob? How would you summarize the plot of this movie?
Without alluding to Bram Stoker's Dracula?
Yep.
Okay. It's the story of a Romanian? No. Transylvanian.
Yep.
Count, who is going to move to England. But
Germany in this story.
Germany in the film, right. And I kind of lost why he sent for the man to help with the transition. But one man was going out to meet him to make the arrangements for him to have a house locally. And while he was there, well, you don't want to tell the whole story, right? Just a summary.
It's supposed to be a real short summary.
Okay.
The reason I'm doing this is so that, like, I've noticed in the past podcasts, I don't really do a good job of telling our audiences what the films we're reviewing is about. So I thought I'd remedy that by saying, hey, we should tell audiences what the movie is about, even though this movie is very popular. So,
well, I guess the main villain is Count Orlok, and he's a vampire. And the man sent to help him make the arrangements to move himself to a more populated area. He actually bites him. But there's also this really strange occult feel to the film, where there's also a connection, an awareness by the man's wife, who's back in Germany and is fearful and she doesn't really understand why she's fearful, but she sort of has this connection and realizes that something horrible is going on, which is very interesting. So it's all about discovering the vampire, and the way he moves in, selects his victim. I don't want to give. There were certain parts which we're going to discuss, but I find it's a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, that's okay.
Wonderful's the wrong word.
Yeah. Lily, you want to give your own synopsis or quick overview of what the plot is about? If you can summarize it.
Possibly. Well, one thing I got out of it from one of the articles we read was, German expressionist film, a ripoff of Dracula, but still of its own character, greatly influenced by the events following World War One. But yeah, I read Dracula in college, so it was fun trying to figure out who was who, the main character-wise, from Bram Stoker's book to this movie. I'm like, oh, that's Mina. Oh, that's Redfield, stuff like that.
Right.
And Van Helsing.
Van Helsing, yeah. So, but I guess a summary would just be, dude wants to take over the world. He's rude. He wants to eat your wife. That's it. He's gonna get some people.
Yeah.
That's my summary.
But that's why I want to have one, because it's so interesting to hear how you would describe this movie to people. You know what I mean? For people who've never ever seen this movie.
My impulse is never to give too much information away when I try and give a synopsis.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to ruin the film for someone.
So that's, we're going to spoil everything here anyways. But
I know. In this forum, I understand. The reason I hesitate on a lot of things I said is because I'm always careful about not giving spoilers.
Oh yeah, in general, yeah, that's a good idea.
So my instinct was to be tight-lipped.
Yeah, my plot summary would be I don't think I've ever read it yet on the IMDb. They usually do a pretty good job of doing that. But if I had to give one, I'd say something like. So like, a husband is, on a business trip, and he's trying to convince Count Orlok to move from Transylvania to Germany, and little does he know, Count Orlok is actually a vampire and is spreading death, essentially bringing death. And so the movie is about the conflict between this main character who is trying to have a business deal of, trying to get this count to move from Transylvania to Germany, but then little does he know, he's going to encounter all sorts of problems with this new tenant who's actually going to live across from his house. So, in summary, that's kind of the plot of the movie, in short. But, of course, as we've already kind of started discussing, the context and the background is that F.W. Murnau, which is the director, he was basically trying to adapt this movie without paying royalty to the Bram Stoker estate. So it was like, we'll just knock this off, but not pay anybody those rights to make this movie.
Right.
So it's kind of funny to do that. In fact, to fill in some of that background, I found it interesting that he and some of these producers and businessmen, it was Enrico Diekmann and Grau and his partners created this new studio called Pranafilm, which means the force of life. He was trying to create a studio, and he was trying to make 3 movies, and I'm so sad he didn't get to make all those 3 movies. I would have loved to see F.W. Murnau make all these 3 movies. The 3 titles were, one of which is Nosferatu, the Symphony of Horror, but then the other 2 was Hellestrom, Dreams of Hell. There's I don't know how to pronounce that. The Devil of the Swamp.
Right.
What? I would love to see what the short Cliff Notes summary ideas of what those stories were. Just the title alone, I want to watch those movies. I was like, oh man, if it weren't for them trying to save some money and knock off Dracula, they could have probably made these other two movies. Who knows?
Yeah.
But anyway,
and the fact that they went broke because they got sued.
Right. That's the end of the story. Is that the Sturga state tried to destroy all the film prints. So thank goodness that somebody saved it, because if they did succeed, the film prints would be gone, and we wouldn't be able to see these movies today. In fact, most of F.W. Murnau's movies are gone or lost. So, anyways, side note. He made like 19 features, and only about 10, 14 of them are lost. And I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Most of them is lost, and we only
12 exist.
Yeah,
I
only
think.
the other, the other end is preserved. But the ones that are preserved is only like bits and pieces, I think. Even this movie, they had to sort of, if you read the intertitle in the beginning, they had to kind of patch it up to make a complete cut at the end. And that's unfortunately the very common practice for silent films. Right. But anyways, I was like, oh man, I really wish I could see those other three movies in the partnership before that temporary production studio or whatever died off. But anyway. What's so overall though, after this plot summary, what did you think? What was this? I think you already know my feelings about it because I already proclaimed it in the beginning. This is a brilliant masterpiece, not just of silent movies, but movies of all time, in my opinion. What did you think? What were your feelings on it? Does it rank up there, or is it like it's okay?
Well, it was a movie. It was one of a very small number of movies that scared the wits out of me as a kid. So I have to put it up there because even now, when I watched it today, and I had great intrepidation about watching it. I really was hesitating and not sure I wanted to do that. And I actually considered turning off the lights because I wanted to increase the impact, and decided not to. I decided I couldn't do that. So yes, just for the impact it had on me, I think I have to say, wow. The villain is famous for a reason. I mean, he is classic horror character.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely classic.
He's scary, downright scary.
From the Victorian era, I think. Lily, what do you think of the movie Nosferatu? What kind of impact did it have on you? I know you read the book itself.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of what impact it had on me. Well, I will just mention that today I was listening, or I watched a small short podcast. It was Joe Rogan who was talking to Rick Baker, who's one of the most well-known in the FX world, for all of his creature masks and whatnot. And he was mentioning about, what they had to do for Count Orlok in his, creating what he would look like to make him so iconic. And because there was such little materials back then, like they had rubber, but really they had nothing else to use besides hair and glue. So because of that, it really framed the outline for stuff we have now today. So in that respect, I really liked Nosferatu because you have to, they built upon this creepy character to make him, I don't know, iconic. I'm not helping.
He was very original. I mean, they picked an actor who the shape of his body lent to the eeriness of the character. I mean, he's long and thin and tall.
And he was also, if you read his bio, he was kind of creepy himself, just in real life.
Yeah, I did read that.
Yeah, he's most well known for this movie, but he's been a stage actor almost all his life, and
he liked his obscurity, though.
Yeah, and he loved to be this creature, not Nosferatu per se, but just all the roles that he performed even in theater. And I think that's the reason, one of the reasons why not just Myrna but all the production partners and companies picked him, because a little even more of the context or background. We could probably dive right in there. Is
Max Schreck? That's his name.
Yeah, Max Schreck, absolutely. But one of the interesting things that they probably all knew each other. Like, there's if you read F.W. Murner's short bio, on his the wiki and stuff, he was under the tutelage of Max Reinhardt. Now, Max Reinhardt is essentially the father, if there was such a single person, of the German expressionistic movement, which isn't just in movies. It came from the stage, in the theater. And they would paint the shadows onto the stage sets, right? Not just using lights. And so when they were doing all of this innovation in the theater, they would all know each other. Like, they all knew, like, Bela Lugosi know these guys, and these guys know, like, they all grew up kind of all in the same thing. And so it makes sense that they would hire somebody who was like, oh, that's got to be him. Like, who can I think right now who's super creepy, who can play Nosferatu? Max Schreck. So yeah, it's just perfect, because he was kind of a character actor in so many ways, back on the stage. And so when they were making this movie, like, who can I? Oh, we know this character actor who's perfect for this. It was great. So that's like the perfect background.
Because now that you bring that up too, it is pretty. It's relevant. You need someone to play. What am I saying? I'm just like comparing that to now, because you think of Guillermo del Toro, and usually he just works with Doug Jones. He's the one who usually plays all of his creepy characters. Like, he played Abe in Hellboy. He was the faun in Pan's Labyrinth. He was the fish monster in the one that won the Oscar
The Shape
a
of
couple
Things?
years ago. Yeah, The Shape of Water.
The water, yeah.
He does all these. He plays all those characters because he's kind of a tall, skinny dude that likes creepy positions. It's weird.
Well, he can withstand the makeup. That's why he's been in the industry a long time. He's one of the few people who can sit there for hours and hours and kind of just, let it in. Not everybody's built for that. I think it's a good time if you guys to peel into that article of the thesis. So we read this article where somebody wrote a thesis about how Nosferatu was a symbol of the fear of death, that there are many scenes. In other words, Count Orlok is a symbol of death. And whichever characters are around him, when they react, it's like they're reacting to death. And it ties a little bit into the Black Plague of the 1300 series, the Black Death from that era, even though the movie took place in the 19th century.
That's the funny thing, is when the opening scene starts with a paragraph talking about the Great Death, and my first curiosity was, did they mean Count Orlok or did they mean the plague? And I wasn't sure, and I think there's a symmetry there going on. So, I mean, certainly the rats and the plague were symbolic and meant to stir the audience intentionally.
Yes.
And nobody of the time would miss that reference.
But I love that thesis in the sense that it gave this incredible context, historic context. It placed the film in the context. And the first podcast we did, we talked at length about why context is so important, because without it, it's really hard to decode and enjoy film. Although, of all the silent films we've seen so far, this is probably the most accessible, I think. One of the most accessible. Because you could probably pop this in and kind of, as long as you get over some of the nuances or some of the features of silent films, like I said, it's something that you're supposed to enjoy in the large theater with live accompaniment. If most people don't get that and they're just watching on their rinky-dink screen, well, they're probably going to experience in that way, but also they'll probably sneer at it, the choppy acting and some the regular things that they sort of point at and laugh at with silent films. However, having said all that, it's still it's still a very popular film in the popular consciousness in the media, in spite of all that flat. You know what I mean?
Yes, it is.
And so it's, of all the silent films we've talked about so far, this is probably the most accessible, and for real good reasons, as we'll really get into. But the first thing I really want to talk about is the context, the time in which the film was.
Can I interject something on that point?
Sure, go ahead.
For all our listeners who might be interested in silent films but aren't already lovers of silent films, the important thing, even if you're watching movies of the 50s and 60s, 70s and 80s, is to enjoy the film, you really have to somewhat try to put yourself into the mentality of the audience that it was made for. So try and think of yourself back in the 1920s, before films were really big, and they were, if you can do that, you'll appreciate the film more, and you're much more forgiving of the lack of technological advancement that we have now. That's all.
Oh, absolutely. That's the things we talked about, which was, I actually, what example did I use, Silly? I tie it to the most modern thing that we can think of today.
Virtual reality.
Yes, yes. So imagine, if you will, like back in the early 1900s, before all this technology of film came out, before even film itself came out, most people enjoy like theater, right? Theater experience and sort of road shows, and that was their primary entertainment. It's the industrialization of the world. They're coming from a agrarian society where people went to bed because they didn't really have a way to get electricity quickly enough, practically into their homes. If you're on a farm, when the sun goes down, you go to sleep. When the sun goes up, you wake up, you do your farm chores, and that's the world they're coming from. And if you have a stage or performing or a carnival troupe coming through at some point in time, then great, you spend some time, money and time to enjoy some entertainment that comes along, whether it's a act or it's some sort of staged entertainment. That's the most common sort of experience, at least in America, and many parts of the world is very, very similar that way too. Entertainment troops coming through the town, you enjoy them, and then kind of move on as traveling troops, entertainment troops. And so that's the world in which these films were introduced, the film medium.
Right.
And that's why I liken to VR, because VR is another sort of, I would say, kind of a seismic shift for technology today. Mm-hmm. And the way we're treating VR, it's like, it's okay, but it's kind of a gimmick. And I feel like that was very similar in the people's mind back in the old days. Is film is kind of a gimmick. I don't know if it's going to survive, and theater is the king, and of course in 20, 30 year time, it actually dominated everything. Right.
VR is the new wave.
Right, but do you know what I mean? Like, that's why I use that as an illustration for modern audiences if they're listening to this, and also in conjunction with the thing you just said was, you got to place yourself in the context of the time in which the movie was shot and made and taking place, so that you can properly sort of figure out how to even watch the movie or enjoy it.
Appreciate it.
When you appreciate it, then it makes sense. And we do that for other things. I don't understand why we kind of don't do that for films. For example, if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, you're supposed to put yourself in the 1400s or when the painters are painting this and figure out, like other arts, you have this, if you're going to appreciate it, you kind of almost automatically have this ability to place yourself in the context of that work and figure it out from there. But like, it's so interesting when audiences are unforgiving for older movies when they don't do that for older movies, and just say it's like, it's kind of just it's cheesy and all that stuff. When in reality, it's very rare actually in silent film that it is that way. Anyway, let's keep moving on. For just the context of this film is the Weimar Republic. This is post World War One. Before they made this this came out in 1922 in the early 20s, and so around that period of time, the way that Germany was, they were trying to be very like nationalistic in the 19-teens when they're making movies. They're like, we're just gonna do our own movies. We're not gonna collaborate. We're just gonna make our own vision what it is. And a lot of them were artistic failures because of that. And so towards the 20s, they started to sort of all come together in this movie studio sort of conglomerate called UFA, I forgot what it's called, but there's this large movie studio. They all collaborated, and they all shared talent, and they all shared artistry, artistic community, and that started to produce some of these greatest, German expressionists and all those great works of art that we're starting to see. And of course, this is one of them, Nosferatu, and that's kind of some of the historic backgrounds that got us into, and some of the other backgrounds was, I was talking about the Max Reinhardt, and a lot of those stage sort of experiences heavily inform German expressionistic movies, including Nosferatu and many others. We've looked at some of them, like The Hands of Orlok, and also like Dr. Caligari, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and certainly, I think Haxan has some of that as well, and we'll actually see some of those influences in this film as well. It's just so interesting that they're all kind of coming up out of the same type of context and background, artistically speaking, as well as historically speaking.
Although, it's funny, I was just looking this up. Rotten Tomatoes has 97% on Nosferatu.
Oh, it's big.
That's huge.
It's
for
huge.
a silent film. That's huge.
Yeah. Well, that's why I say it's one of the great masterpieces of our time. So we'll just, at this point, kind of dive right into it. It's divided into literal 5 acts. Like, most movies don't tell you, but this movie is just like, here's act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I love that about this movie. In the beginning, there's a few missing footages that they kind of pulled from different prints to create this print, and they finally stitched it all together. There's a Restoration Institute, Film Rights Institute in Germany called the I don't know what it's called nowadays. It's Myrna is one of them. It's like a Myrna something Institute. Oh, film preservation. I'm sure it'll come to me later. So they help preserve this film master, and so they help also partly restore this as well. And they're kind of the keepers of the German film flame, as it were. And certainly this is one of the most famous and popular. So they're one of the primary guys who have restored this back to the original glory. And I love that this is one of the few silent films had an original score commissioned. So Hans Erdmann, 1922 score. Did you guys watch the Kino copy, or maybe even the other DVD copy, or is it on YouTube?
I only watched the YouTube one.
I don't know
That's what I watched.
Did the music actually sync up with the movie? I didn't know what was out there.
It was a lot of organ, but it wasn't complete organ, but it was a lot of organ.
Yeah.
I noticed in parts.
Same with you, Bob? Organ for you as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. We watched the same one.
Oh, okay.
What?
So unfortunately, you guys didn't watch it with the score, because I watched the DVD version. I got it out of the local library.
Oh, so we had different music playing. Huh?
Yes, which makes a huge difference.
Of course it does.
Yes.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
And I had a criticism of the music in the one I watched.
Well,
which
there you
was,
go.
It didn't sync up in some parts. It was very bizarre. Like, there was very complex music playing in a scene where it seemed like they should have had like an almost still playing violin, like very long, drawn out, like notes, and it should have been very quiet music during certain scenes, and they still had this like very complex thing going on, and I was like, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, this is why I prefer to get the Kino or DVD copy or Criterion, whatever, because it's a curated experience. Whereas YouTube, they don't have the rights to the music. It's copyrighted,
Gotcha.
right? Even though the film is often, at the end of the day, going into public domain nowadays, a lot of the older films, the music itself, whether it's newly composed, like the Berklee College of Music film scores, those are copyrighted, of course. And so, like, with those experiences, it's really hard to watch that on YouTube because, obviously, YouTube is all about copyright. You can't upload, copyrighted stuff on there. They'll take it down, And so, the music portion of this is localized to just, like, for example, the Kino copy, the Kino lower DVD copy that I have. So, anyways. So I highly recommend, if you guys have time, to revisit it with the original Hans Erdmann score. I should have made a note last week to tell, or a couple weeks ago to tell you guys that, but maybe I missed it.
That's okay. The fact that we watched the YouTube one allowed you to illustrate that very more clearly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say that the score is amazing, and it really underscored, no pun intended, the emotional through line of the entire film. I've seen this movie a few times before, and it's been at least 20 years, I think. But I probably forgotten more than I remember. So when I watched
this, I haven't seen it since I was a child.
Yeah,
so,
and I watched
and that
this,
probably had the original sound.
Yeah, and so I have like a home theater, I think, like you, Bob, at home, and I have a front screen projector, and it's like 1080 and it's 100-inch and stuff. So I watched this on the big screen, and I try to do as much as I can. And I didn't realize, using the score, the original score that was commissioned by the filmmakers and the producers and everyone, how emotional it was. I rarely remember in the old days when I was watching silent films a lot that any of the silent films were emotional, except for the Chaplin ones. He's always much more that way. But I was really shocked. I was like, this score really, changed my experience and perspective of Nosferatu when I watched it. I don't remember what copy I watched a long time ago, but whatever copy I watched, it definitely wasn't this one because I really felt the sort of the marital bliss and also just the whole apart and together again through line throughout the whole movie, and they had a beautiful theme with the score running throughout. And the score also gave, appropriate moments when Count Orlok was doing his thing, with the shadows and everything. So it just was an amazing score. I was kind of surprised. Usually even with original scores, I kind of go, it's okay, or it's like I usually poo-poo it. I'm a big champion of modern score rewrites, which is really unusual because most fans of silent films like to champion the original stuff. I would say most are more purists. They're like, well, the original artist commissioned this guy to do it, so it better be good. You know what I mean? And I'm always
that would be me as well.
Yeah, and so I'm usually like, maybe, but because I've seen so many of these silent films, and I'm just like, in my experience, it's not usually really good. In my experience, it's usually like what you guys watch on YouTube, which is like, in the wrong, incorrect emotional tides of the film. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it could be subpar.
Yeah, it ends up being terrible. The music itself, and even original score accompaniments. But then it could just be the bad copies I get. I don't know. It's a long time ago now. I can't remember all the details of which copy and which scores, come up with which, But nowadays, there's a lot more meticulous study of pairing both. You know what I mean? So that's something that I highlighted right away. Just the score itself was amazing. So hopefully in the future, I feel like this movie is a film worth revisiting just in time. So if you guys ever revisit, make sure you get the Kino copy with the Hans Erdmann score, because that is the most amazing score for this movie that I've heard. So
okay.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now and I can't find it. Ah!
Yeah, I got it to the library, so you guys can probably get it from the same library system because we all share the same library systems.
Right.
I think in spite of the, I think I'll have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to, appreciate it better because, like we were saying with this music, it wasn't terrible, but, it just seemed too repetitive.
Right.
So that's why it's like,
It was a little too much like filler.
Yeah, I may have
Yeah.
looked up Nosferatu on YouTube, but I can't remember. I could have sworn that there was a copy with the Erdmann score because they came out with this print with the score in 2001, I'm pretty sure. But I can't remember. We can look that up later. When the film started, and right away, there's a town called Wisberg, right, which is a fictional town. It's not a real town of Germany.
Right.
And right away, the first shot was of the town, but also it seemed to focus on this building with arches. Like this, I don't know if it was a cathedral or some sort of building architecture. I thought that was interesting because it comes up again later in the movie. Because the shape of the buildings in the city, in the town, is something. There's a recurring motif in there. And that's just on the buildings. So that's why the movie's so great. Like there's the arches, and the arches seems to indicate like coffins. So when he shot the foreground and background of the arch of the buildings in the town that Wisberg, that the Hutter and Ellen, the married couple, the main character, one of the main characters in here, and it's like, well, we're going to establish that this is Wisberg, but we're going to shoot it with the arch, and the arch equals coffin. It's like foreshadowing. We know where he's going. And when Orlok has landed in Wisberg, or the port or something, and is heading toward Wisberg, towards the house across from the street, he traverses through multiple arches.
When he's walking with
when he's walking around in the building, if you look in the background, there's all these buildings have arches. So, and they're not rounded, whereas the Hutter and Ellen, the buildings that they traverse, is more rounded, which seems to suggest it's more warm. Like the family life is warm, whereas the arch that's sharp is like the coffin. It's more angular and more like death. So I thought that was interesting. I just love that. That's just the first shot. We haven't even gotten to the rest of the movie. Just when he starts FW Murder, when he starts to shoot the background, the foreground, and the characters, just like Caligari and maybe Orlok too, I love sort of the interplay between the background activities and the foreground. There's just always something going on in the background, in the foreground, like all the time, and it's incredibly rich. Like when towards the end of the movie, when the town was dying of people and there's multiple coffins, there was like 4 or 5 coffins on a street of the town.
They're carrying them in the line. Yeah.
But the shot was incredible. It was like 4 or 5 in a row, all the way down to the back. I don't know. It could be a mile or something, right? Or maybe not a mile, but like, like that shot was amazing. But it's shots like that that's just like that's incredible, People like to focus on like the makeup of Knock. Now Knock is the real estate guy, and this is the thing is he's the real estate manager, and he's telling Hutter to say, look, you're the real estate agent. If you can sell your house across from the house across from the street from your house, which is like a dilapidated building. He's like, if you sell that, you could be rich.
Yep. You should note that Knock was the Renfield character. He was the minion of Count Orlok.
Right. Exactly. But I never read the book, and
he was a really creepy character in himself. I thought he was done really well.
That's what I mean. Is his makeup itself was just as good as Orlok, and many people actually in this movie, the makeup was really good. Even the main characters, everybody was made up really good. I think you can focus on this movie and, any number of characteristics of this film, and it's done really well. And that's the hallmarks of great masterpieces and classics, is that you can take a slice of any aspect of this film and basically be like, wow, that is amazing. You know what I mean? What do you think, Lily, of the opening shots, of the scenes, of...
Well, I'm not going to lie. I watched it, but I don't really remember any of it. Because I remember, once you were mentioning about the arches, I remember reading it in the articles talking about that. And I was like, oh, yeah. But I personally, don't really, I didn't really pay attention to it. I was more focused on how is this going to take off.
Yeah.
But one thing I did pay... Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention about how the clothing represented character. It was something I noticed because I watched specific scenes over again before we started our podcast. Just to, I hadn't watched it for over a week, so I'm like, I really should try to, relive it. And it was just thinking, when Hutter arrived to the castle, I noticed his clothing in compared to Count Orlok's. His arrival, he's wearing like a tan or white traveling cloak while the Count is in black, and it was the same thing for Ellen when she's in bed or anytime she's wandering around. She's usually in some type of white nightgown.
Yep.
I was just comparing that because I was using that clothing identity to be that they're untarnished as of yet.
Yeah.
And then once after that, they're tarnished, they're ruined off.
It's tied to the book, right? That book that Hutter found in that Transylvania village about how you have to be, maiden pure or something, and you have to sacrifice yourself to defeat the
She had to distract him with sacrificing herself to distract him so that he wouldn't be aware of the time and the sun would come up.
Exactly. So that's the prophecy of...
It's a prophecy.
Yeah. So, like, I was starting to say that I didn't read the book myself, and I probably have seen, like, the Dracula movies in the past, but I've never really, like modern movies, by modern I mean post-silent films, I haven't really seen a lot of Dracula movies myself. I mean, every now and then I'd see, like, What We Do in Shadows or something like that.
I actually hate vampire movies in general. Very few have done much justice in my mind to the Dracula character.
Right.
It should be much more mysterious. Now, Bram Stoker's Dracula tried, and I give it credit for a lot of beautiful scenes, but it still didn't hit me nearly the way this one or Bela Lugosi's does. I mean, you could argue about Bela Lugosi's, but I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think... it goes down to that article about the Scientology. If you click into the review, but then under the review, it talks about, it basically debunks the myth that even just based on the book, not even all the movies, but based on the book itself, like all these studies and analysis afterwards, post like Freudian and Carl Jung sort of psychoanalyzing it, they've started to sexualize a lot of the elements of the whole sort of Dracula, sucking blood and life and death and all that stuff. And in that article, I love that article that was debunking the whole thing one by one. It was like, it wasn't meant that way, and Stoker wasn't like this. And I mean, you read the book, Lily. What do you think? I don't know if you read that particular article debunking that myth.
Did I read that one?
It basically was a link. It was like buried two levels deep, which is what I texted you guys. It was like, well, there's the review of basically the background of how Nosferatu was made, and in it there was a link to say, here's my review of it. So if you click on the review, then the person reviews the Nosferatu movie, and then inside the review was another link saying, here's the article that debunks, why Bram Stoker's Dracula was not sexualized.
Oh, okay.
But again, that's like a thesis too. That's like a long, boring paper too. If you guys want to read that, that's just as long as the other one.
But yeah, so the way Dracula is written, it's written in like letters. So they talk, it starts with Jonathan Harker, and he's talking about his experience and going to see Dracula and blah, blah, blah. Then it would change over to Mina, and then she's talking about her experiences, talking back and forth with Jonathan. And then it might move on to Dr. Sewell, who wasn't really mentioned in Nosferatu, or he might have been, I'm not sure. But, they were basically notes, and they're writing, they're just... They were journaling. That was the better word. They were journaling down everything that was going on, and then it would flip to another character, and then they would journal down their notes. That's the way he wrote it in the book. But there wasn't anything to do with that in Nosferatu.
Yeah, well, I think my point I was trying to get at was more tying to what Bob was saying was like all these sort of post Bela Lugosi Dracula seems to focus on sort of the cliches that have then since been set up.
Yes, yeah, they were very sexualized.
Exactly, so it
wasn't like that. No.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is like Lugosi himself brought this gentlemanly, like handsome-looking sort of vampire Dracula guy. So like that's sort of the first change away from the original book, right? I haven't read it, but I heard that...
I think he was supposed to be an aristocrat in the book because he had been around for so long that he was supposed to be very gentlemanly.
But he was supposed to be sort of like a monster, right?
Yeah.
He's supposed to be like this very... Like, if you pull back the mask, as it were, he's supposed to
He's a vampire.
Yeah.
I know, he's a suave vampire. He wants Jonathan Harker, and he's like, hey, come on down.
No, what I'm saying is, I thought that like I said, I didn't read it, but I thought that the book described the physical attributes of Dracula as being like this monster, closer to Nosferatu. Was that accurate? I don't know. I haven't read the book.
I haven't read it, you know what I mean?
I believe I read Dracula when I was a kid, and that did not feel that way to me. He seemed very sophisticated, and like when, I forgot the character's name, but the man visiting, the real estater character, thought he was very respectable and very easy to admire. So I think
I was talking about more when he was sucking up people's blood, when he was in his evil incarnate nature. The description was very
in the book.
Yeah, in the book was more monster-like, right?
I feel like he was just he looked dead, but he was alive. I feel like that was the only real description.
Oh, okay. Like I said, I didn't read.
It was more primal.
I almost got so ambitious myself. I was like, oh man, I should read the book. And I was like, and then I looked at the page count. I was like, oh man,
it's like 300 pages.
Yeah, it's like 500 pages. I'm like, that's beyond me.
I don't recall the book ever describing a physical difference, but more his emotional and mental state during feeding.
I see. So I was under the mistaken impression that it was something more monstrous, I think, rather than like gentlemanly. So when Bela Lugosi was portraying him as not a monster but more gentleman, it started to veer off in the wrong direction. But if that's accurate, then it's more true to the book. Be that as it may,
I think you're correct. I think that their take on making him more gentlemanly during the act was not quite accurate.
Right. Anyway, so like after that, all the psychoanalysis articles started to influence the arts. And so with all these adaptations, stage and theater and movies, they all started to sort of, veer towards all of those other elements of starting to sexualizing everything and bringing, sort of adding to the mythology, as it were, things that wasn't there in the book, right? Now, that's what I love about Nosferatu, going back to Nosferatu, is that it didn't really, alter the book in so much as it's paying homage to it, but also it's adding to the mythology of the book things that probably weren't in the book too. Like you guys were just describing, we didn't see him as a physical manifestation of sort of the evil that he represents. And I think the analysis article debunking the myths of Dracula, in modern times, one of the myths was like he's supposed to be. So the name Dracula just means Satan or evil or devil. He read that somewhere in conjunction with the Bram Stoker when he's writing the book. He ended up lifting that from some I forgot now, some resource he was reading, and he was like, oh, this is perfect. It's probably some sort of like Eastern Europe language, and one of the translation came back as, you know, like, this is the evil incarnate, you know, Satan himself.
The original was Romanian.
Romanian, that's what it was. So that language was translated, and it was like Dracula. It was the perfect name for this character, and he took it and made this character Dracula. I'll get to the book eventually, just not in the foreseeable right now. After my long queue of books I'm reading, but so that's what's fascinating to me, is that this movie broke new grounds by not only paying homage but also adding to the mythology of Dracula. The thing about like dissolving, you know, the end where the sun would kill,
burns him up
rather than just harm. I think I read that in the book. It just sort of, you know, it's more of a nuisance, but it didn't really kill him if he remained in daylight or something like that, right?
I think so.
So that's what I love about like the way that they're adapting this, is that not only are they, for, you know, legal reasons, not directly adapting it, but by circumventing, I feel like they're also inventing new things that were pretty cool, that I truly loved doing. So yeah, so like even that parchment in the beginning where the real estate guy Knock, he was looking at this parchment of one question I had was, I didn't know, because I didn't read the books, I couldn't make that connection, where the movie doesn't make that connection. Has Knock actually physically visited or talked to Count Orlok? That, like, has he met him or something? It didn't really talk about it in the movie, I think.
Didn't.
No.
That's what I was trying to get, is how does Orlok influence Knock? Like, what is that connection?
I think...
Because he's clearly under the influence, because he's looking at this parchment of all this, which are, oh, by the way, real occultist symbols, by the way.
Right.
Because
which I thought was bizarre.
Well, it's because the one of the producers of the movie, not Murnau, but the Gabu or Grabu, whatever his name
Grau, maybe.
Grau, yeah, sorry. Grau, he is into occults, and he basically filled out the rest of the movie with the occult details.
It's just very interesting that the film was German, and obviously the silent films were before, well, there were censors in a way, but it was only the public's view of whether it was going to be, palatable or not. But we sort of, in film, we sort of went through this era of what many things that would not be accepted, such as that.
Right.
And then this pendulum swung again to anything goes.
Right.
So it's just very interesting that in old films you might see things like that, you know, I could see certain elements being very opposed to that.
Yeah. But anyways, I want to bring that specific scene up because remember when Knock was like, okay, well, you can go off now to visit Count Orlok, and then he did this maniacal evil laugh, which is like...
Right. It seemed to me that he had been in correspondence with Orlok.
Yeah, I couldn't quite figure out what that connection is, other than the fact that there is an influence right from the get-go, you could see.
There's a supernatural influence.
Yeah, I don't know what that... It's so fascinating. And, But my favorite part, really, of this scene is, like, you know when he's doing his maniacal laugh? Like, he's like, like when he's doing that scene, which is very, now, stereotypical, but, like, when Knock was doing that, it's a silent movie. You can't hear the laugh, and yet when he performs it, what's happening in your brain?
You know exactly what's going on. Yeah.
Does that make sense to you, Lily?
So
when
you're hearing it, absolutely.
Right, so even though you didn't, yeah, exactly. So you didn't hear the actual audible sound, but when he performed it in such a rabid fashion, you heard it.
Yep.
That's my favorite
He's a
part.
madman.
Yeah,
yep.
That's my favorite, like one of my favorite parts. It's so like minor, but it's one of my favorite parts of sort of the silent film. And that's just the opening scenes.
Right.
So, like, just, if you haven't noticed by now, F.W. Murnau is my favorite director, I think, of the silent film era.
Okay.
I just absolutely adore everything he's done. I've seen almost everything. And in my research in this movie, I discovered that 2 more movies were found, I think, since I last watched his movies 20 years ago. And I was like, whoa, now I got new stuff for me to watch. New to me, anyway.
When he's instructing the young man to go off to Transylvania, it was really funny because I felt like he was almost Jekyll and Hyde there.
Yes.
He was hiding the note, but then he couldn't resist looking at it one more time to finish reading it. And then he turned back to him and he was all friendly, but then he turned to the camera and he'd be like, ah!
Which F.W. Murnau did a movie, the Jekyll and Hyde version. They did an
adaptation
really? Of that. Yeah, so it's very interesting that you should mention that. Just a few years ago, he did a version of that. Yeah. And as the, going back into his wife and saying, I gotta go, and she's like, no, and they apparently he goes, drops her off into some wife-sitting couple for whatever reason. But my favorite part of that is that even the outdoor scenes, like the trees and the shadow. Oh, and by the way, you guys know the tint, right? Just so you know, this whole thing is tinted. I don't know if the copy you saw was tinted.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So their married life is all gold. It's all happy,
right?
Rosy. And then the daytime scenes is always gold, the sun, the beam, and then there's some pinkish, reddish tints, and then there's the blue tint. Blue is nighttime. Just
right.
So you know. So sometimes I'm like, what time is it? Why is he walking out in the daytime? Oh, it's nighttime because it's the blue tint.
Exactly.
So you just have to make that. You have to make that leap because if you don't, you just be like, he's walking around the sunlight.
That's what it seemed like to me, and I knew it wasn't. So I said, okay, it's bright moonlight, but
it's the tint that determines that. The tint determines the day of the time of the day. So
yeah, I can't help but be a critic when I watch films. Curse of seeing a lot of films is I thought that it would have been nice if he put in a 3-second clip of the moon in the middle of that scene.
Yes.
Just above him, maybe, a street scene with the moon, just in the background, just so everyone can go, oh, okay.
But you know why that he doesn't do that? It's because of the context of the time. So, in other words, many other people were tinting movies. And so, if you were a movie watcher in the teens and 20s and you're watching silent films, you wouldn't basically know that blue is nighttime and gold is
right. You would intuitively know it, right?
No, you've seen a decade or two of movies by now, and they trained you on that.
Right. That's what I'm saying. You would intuitively know it.
That's what I'm saying. Is if you were a person of that time, that's why you got to know the context and history, right? Now we're looking back, we're I wish they did put the shot of the moon or the sun in.
Right.
But if you were,
it wouldn't have been necessary from
exactly.
their perspective.
That's my point. Is if you were a person who was from that era of time, you've already seen you've had 10, 20, 2 decades, 1 or 2 decades of this experience already, so you know that gold is sun and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
The tree, just even the when Hutter gets on his horse and is heading towards it, just the trees and the shadow, just that shot was amazing. It was a golden, sunbathed outdoor, and him just getting on a horse, which is very innocent. If you look at the first third or first act, I guess, of the movie, it's kind of slow. He's just getting on a horse and he's going someplace. It's it's really slow to get going. But there's so many things happening, so much foreshadowing happening just in those scenes, and that's why it's one of the greatest movies of all time, is because even such small details, like the tree, shadowing on the floor when he's riding the horse is predicting doom and gloom. Even the tree shadows is So when he goes finally crosses the bridge, right? So moving forward a little bit, picking up the pace. And he goes he crosses the bridge, right? And then Count Orlok, under disguise, picks him up in his weird coach
Mm-hmm.
with the covered, even the horses.
Yeah, that
covered.
entrance was really interesting too. The way they cut with the what do they write down? Yeah, they removed every other frame, I think, to give it a creaking appearance.
It's a jump cut.
They just jump cut. Okay, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it gives you this eerie feeling that something's not right. It's an emotional response, right? Mm-hmm. It's a technical thing he's doing, but it gives you this incredible unease in feeling. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but after Orlok gets him into the coach, and they go through a bunch of forests and stuff like that, one of the specific scenes of the forest was inverted film negative. Do you guys notice that?
Yeah,
yes,
it was weird.
I did.
That basically was like, again, if you read the other articles about the death and stuff, it was like this tunnel between real life and like death or afterlife, whatever.
The passing between, yeah.
Yeah, he's going into another world, the shadow world.
Dun dun dun.
Yeah, and I love that. Like, and that's just the first fifth of the movie. Like, we haven't even gotten to the meat of it.
Now, yeah.
Now, just to pause here for a little bit, we talked about Jean-Luc Godard in the 60s. He did a movie called Breathless. And in this movie, he did a bunch of jump cuts. And so he was basically highly regarded as the French New Wave, because he popularized this new editing technique where instead of like having the camera record every single little action, he would just cut, just like the way we did with Orlok's introduction. Many of Orlok's scenes was like jump cuts, just to make sure that in this movie, in the context of this movie, makes you feel unease. But in 40, 50 years later, in the 60s, Jean-Luc Godard got huge praises for that. He was just like, "Oh, this guy's a genius. He invented jump cuts for movies." But guess what? This is 1922, and we've already seen it here, right? You get what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
So we're praising this guy like, "Oh yeah, Ren, he did all this spectacular stuff." Guess what? It's right here in this movie, jump cuts. It's not the whole movie, which is I think is the praise given him in that movie in the 60s for the French New Wave. But still, it's the jump cut's been used to elicit an effect. And in this movie, it's an incredible effect of eeriness, of otherworldly, of this incredible weirdness. Like, what is going on? You know what I mean? So,
yep.
At this point, I wrote down, who is writing the intertitles? Do you guys have a guess? Like, somebody's writing this as like, it's kind of like the thing you just described, Lily, about the book. In the book, there's a literary device, right? That Bram Stoker uses to be like,
Is it Murnau?
How's that?
Is it Murnau?
No. What I'm saying is, like, who in the movie, in terms of character, there's a character in the movie, right?
Oh, who's telling the story?
Exactly, because if you read their intertitles, it's a musing of a person who's a character in the movie. He's an observer, but who is the character, right?
That is a good question, because you think, well, Ellen dies.
Right. And
yeah, she died.
Some of the people who died, right? So, like, who is writing the intertitles? That's why, because when you read the intertitles, it's a storyteller who is a character in the movie. So at that point,
does it have to be a character in the movie?
Yeah, he makes reference. The intertitles makes references to that, like, oh, this.
Well, you only know that if he says "I."
Right. So
if he refers to himself.
That's the interesting part. But anyway,
he didn't, did he?
Oh, well, I think towards the end, it's my guess. I don't know for sure, but I feel like it's probably the Bulworth character. The professor,
I was just gonna say it was probably the doctor.
That's what I was thinking.
Who was doing the fly trap, Venus flytrap experiment.
Right. That's what I was thinking as well.
Yeah, exactly. And he's Van Helsing. He's Van Helsing. He's
Van Helsing. Right.
He's basically Van Helsing. So.
Oh.
Yeah, that's who he is.
Was he in the book? Again.
Was he in the book?
Yes.
Van Helsing?
He was.
Oh yeah.
So that's him. Anyways, so moving further down, and that's the next scene or next few scenes. That's where it gets into all that. And this it goes beyond just a horror movie or genre movie. It goes into like this Professor Bulworth talking about the Venus flytrap experiment and talking about nature, predator and prey, There's
Right.
a deep, deep imagery of like this
And-
polyp with tentacles and spiders and the things that caught.
Well, Knock is pointing at the spider
Yeah, and they're eating each other.
that sucks the blood out of its victim.
Yep.
So it's very interesting that Knock was pointing to the spider, and he was showing his, well, I don't know what they were. I thought they were students, perhaps.
Yeah, the students.
The Venus flytrap. So they were doing the same thing, two
Yep.
characters.
And there was like a montage, right?
Yep.
Of the ties between the two.
Yes, and then I forgot his name. What was the main character who went to
Hutter.
Hutter.
Hutter and
And Hutter was experiencing it in a different way.
Exactly. That's it all ties together, and I love that that very scene just elevates the movie.
It does.
Like, at first, it was just like, oh, I'm just watching a vampire movie.
That segment of the movie is very memorable.
Yeah. So that is like, and the reason why that's so significant, again, you have to look at the cultural context of that time, and not just Germany, but all of the modern world or the post-industrialized world. They were trying to investigate. Remember, this is the time post Darwin and post Freud, post Jung. I mean, Jung. They're all contemporaries. They're all contemporaries. They're, at some point, some of them were still alive, and also post like this whole notion of who are we as a human in the place in the natural realm? Like, are we supposed to be the predator or the prey? And like, all of that was very topical, like in the news in the 19-teens and 1920s.
Right.
And the fact he just lifted that in the context of his time and placed it into this movie, even though it was just a few seconds or a few minutes, dude, it elevates this movie to a whole nother realm because it seems like it's just still relevant today. Like, wow, you know. So
in terms of a vampire, we're now the sheep, and it's the predator.
Yeah,
right.
It's just amazing, and not only that, is it just like, is the Black Death, the plague, which is what Orlok represents by the way he carries the coffins everywhere with him, representing the dirt that he was buried with because he's cursed with that. Like, is he just the Black Death, and is that just nature's, quote unquote, nature's way of purging humanity because we're like, causing environmental harm to Earth? And so the nature's response, again, going back to the Professor Bulwer's experiments, is it just like we're supposed to be purged by Nosferatu, which is symbolic of the death, the Black Death, the plague, right? Because we're destroying nature, right?
That's one way to look at it.
But that's the thing it brings up. Is my point?
It's the question.
Is the point?
It's a question.
Like,
that
I
it
love
poses
that
to
this
the audience.
movie, like, it just doesn't do like, oh, it's just a vampire movie and I'm sucking a blood.
Right.
It's like,
it poses that
whoa! It's like a whole next level of experience in this movie that you don't normally get, even now today, for vampire movies, right?
I agree.
So,
Yeah, I agree on that too.
It's funny. There's an eerie scene, which I laughed because it seemed so shocking in a way. It shocked me. Was when the picture of Hutter's wife fell on the table, and Orlok looked at it carefully and said, "Your wife has a beautiful neck."
Yeah, that scene made me laugh. I was just like, smooth.
It made me laugh, but it was so eerie and wrong.
yeah.
He did. He recoiled and went and put it in his pocket like, what is that supposed to mean?
Because especially if I think he just read that other book about the sucking of the blood and stuff.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
his suspicions are slowly being confirmed. Oh man. But I love those.
That scene
little
freaked
pieces.
me out.
Oh
It
yeah.
did. I was like, your wife has a lovely neck. I'd be like, how would I react to that? Like,
Yeah.
ah.
Now, when Hutter was in that castle with Orlok, somehow Ellen and him are spiritually, supernaturally connected because
Yeah.
somehow she reacts to senses some danger
Yeah.
in Hutter or something.
To Hutter. Yeah.
There's something, and this is even before Orlok was like, I don't understand.
He
I just
hadn't
don't understand
arrived.
that part. I don't know.
It's right. It's supernatural beyond the distance from Transylvania to Germany. Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, she has to, be taken care of by a doctor, and she's convalescing in some beach. And even there, I don't know if you notice, on the beach, there are like crosses everywhere.
Crosses. I was like, she's convalescing on a beach graveyard. That's weird.
Yeah, that is weird.
Yeah.
So, but it's not. Again, nothing is by accident with this director in this.
Oh no!
It's amazing. Every little detail just fills the whole picture in incredibly, just totally incredibly. And even on the beach, right? Like when I don't remember their names, but the Hutter and Ellen's family friends, I guess, who are taking care of Ellen while Hutter's away. The couple who was playing what's that yard game? The thing with the ball.
Croquet.
Yeah, what's it?
Croquet.
Yeah, you guys know more about that than me. So when they were playing, and like it seemed like an ideal life, there was a nice juxtaposition between them and their Hutter and Ellen's relationship. Like there was that interesting interplay. But not only that, when they finally got the letter, right, from Hutter, and then they delivered the letter to Ellen on the beach. Just that simple scene is just normally like simple. There's nothing going on, and yet that whole scene is a story unto itself. That's a mark of a classic movie, any movie in any era, where you can take a simple scene like that, and you can tell a story again, even without words, when the couple, like the couple is taking care of Helen, their relationship there, even though it's a simple game of crochet, and then like contrast that against Hutter and Ellen's relationship of being apart. And not only that, when both couples delivered that letter, they were standing up above her bench, so she was lower than they are. So that perspective and that mise-en-scene, that framing, was incredible because she's at a low point, right, and they're in the high point of their lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's like a simple scene, but you can tell a story. Like great directors do that all the time, right? The greatest directors, even a simple scene, like the thing we just talked about, Hitchcock. That's how he does it. It's all about like moving the actors around within the given
body
scene,
language, symbolism,
just to
framing.
tell a story.
Yeah.
In just 15 minutes, you can tell a story within just that one scene, right? So that's the beauty of directors like this. They're so amazing, even though it's so simple, so easy, so straightforward. It's like a transcendent experience, just watching a movie like this for a simple scene. And yet they're so rich. It's so rich and packed with details, Any other thoughts on this scene?
I don't.
Finally, well, not finally, but I got more. But I'll fast forward a little bit. So my big highlight is that if Orlok finally makes it to the ship, right? And the cinematography on the ship, to me, feels like a 2019 modern movie. I don't know if you guys feel that way. But have you seen the movie Master and Commander with Russell Crowe?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
No.
Or any, like Pirate of the Caribbean. Doesn't matter. Any
Yes.
modern movies with ships, right? When they shoot ships, there's a way to shoot ships that's so modern, that's different than the movies made 100 years ago. The way they're shooting ships nowadays, in modern era, is they'll have a camera and the camera will, like, shoot the ship, but the ship is traversing from right to left, right? But the camera will pass the ship, and the camera's focus will be on the ocean. Like, it will just literally allow the ship to pass you, like you're just on a little boat passing the ship yourself. Mm. That's a very common shot for modern movies. Mm. But this guy, in his company, his production company, did this in 1922, right?
Mm.
Like, that shot was like a 2019 shot. All these shots with this
right.
were like that.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, they're like if you watch a movie in that era.
I did sort of notice that, too. I thought... I remember that. I remember being impressed with how they filmed the ship. But I didn't know why.
All these ship shots of the 1910s, they're very static. It's like, here's the ship, and That's it. Like it's like boom, established ship. That's it.
Right.
But to move like a boat, like you're on a boat and you're watching the ship pass you by, is incredible.
Yeah.
Like that's an amazingly artfully composed, so detailed. Like the reason why I'm pointing all these little details for you guys is because every one of these little details actually contributes towards the final result of why it's a masterpiece and why you can often feel connected to this movie because of all those specific background feelings. You know, that's what makes all these classics, because classics is a summation of these little moments, right? So, even like the water foaming, you know, as the ship is passing by the ocean, you don't get shots like that, you know. And at the end of this particular scene, there was a shot of, this is probably later on, but when they're done with the ship, when the captain's dead and stuff like that, there's a shot where it's probably the sun, but it's like the moon, I guess. The sun's beam rays is peering through the mast holes. Like
I remember that.
Yeah,
that was wild.
Wow, what? Like it's like that's incredible. Like it's a 2019 shot in 1922.
That was pretty amazing.
Yeah, like it's like I don't know.
I remember stopping and going, "How did he do that?"
I know. It's like it's intentional. It's not like just an accident. I captured something beautifully by accident. A side note: I noticed that this is totally. The ship's captain towards the end, his hair looks like Wolverine.
Of course,
his hair is all stuck up.
I noticed that. Yeah.
But the makeup is amazing. Is the point? Is that everybody's makeup, not just Orlok, although he's really good.
That was the scene.
Amazing.
The ship scene was another one that I thought made it really clear. You know, because he didn't need at that point to show. Well, I guess he didn't need to show the rats, but he took a really long shot of them coming from the crate. Did you notice that? It was a really long shot. It was like intended to make the audience squirm.
Yes. Just creepy.
Yep.
Every shot of Orlok is just super creepy. Obviously intentionally.
Yeah, one of the creepiest shots for me is when he's in the doorway.
Oh, yeah.
And the guy's curled up in his bed. And
yep.
He's in the doorway. That scene is just monumentally iconic.
Yeah. Oh, there are many scenes here that's iconic.
Well, yeah. The shadow on the wall, of course, is the most famous.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But there are many famous shots. Like when towards the end when the captain's tied a rope around his
the steering
waist.
wheel.
Yeah, steering wheel, and Orlok's creeping towards him, like over,
right.
and it's a low shot, it's a low angle shot, so he's got the power, he's got the upper
looking
hand,
up,
right?
Exactly.
And so that's an iconic shot. It's up here in posters and stuff like that everywhere.
And they don't show them together. They only show Orlok looking, focusing up on him, and then they show the captain looking up, and they don't show them together at all.
Yeah.
So you can just see that the captain's is, what is that? It's coming for me. You know? Ooh.
And what's creepy too is the way that Orlok sort of travels in general, whether it's by horse or boat or land. It just glides. Like he doesn't walk, he glides, right? And he walks through doors like an apparition. It's not even corporeal. There's mentions of Deathbird. He's another name for him in the movie. And like even the ship is like unmanned. After the crews are all dead, it just sails itself like a ghost ship. So freaky, right?
That really made me totally I was so confused by that. I said, okay, that supernatural power, I guess.
Yes.
He's willing the ship where he wants it to be.
Yeah. His death wind.
I have an interesting tidbit here. I learned that I looked up the word Nesuferit is Nesuferit in in the dictionary, that's what language? What language did I say it was?
Romanian?
Romanian, thank you. And it has as synonyms creep, abominable, cursed, hateful, icky, ill-tempered, insufferable, unbearable.
I mean, just as makeup, he's supposed to look like a rat. Just like the rats he's bringing, right?
That makes sense. He does. He does
More
indeed.
like a rat monster instead of a vampire.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was very funny also that the guy writes to back home and says, you know, he had he said the mosquitoes are ridiculous. I had a pair of mosquito bites on my neck. I was like,
mosquitoes are ridiculous.
Those are some really giant mosquitoes.
Yeah. They happen to land right next to each other, almost. I love it.
But it's a clue.
Yeah, it is a clue. Just the plotting, too, right? The screenplay and the story, how it's written, is great. So, on all accounts, I mean, direction, set pieces,
yep.
Artwork, everything. The score.
Another scene that really freaked me out is when they show him sucking the blood out of the woman's when she's asleep.
Oh, yeah.
That scene just makes me like, squirm
crazy.
inside.
Yeah, it's all acting, you know? It's amazing. There was, when the captain's finally dead and the crew, the host of people, I guess, to try to investigate the ship, they grab the ship log from the captain's quarter.
Right.
I noticed, I don't know what is on the ceiling, but there was a light bouncing around, like, in the ceiling. Like a light from the outside, I guess is the sun, going through the shaft or the window of the ship on the ship quarter.
Do you think it was intentional?
Oh, absolutely intentional. I just don't know what it was bouncing around in there. But it also it highlights just the direction and the lighting and everything of how masterful it is. Just like that little detail of like, there's so much going on in the background and the ceiling.
Maybe he just wanted the room to feel like it more real life by having a light that's shining in somewhere.
Well, it was moving. It was like on a ship moving. Something was rocking back and forth, you know. So it was like a plate or glass or something. I love that. Like, it's not like the movie, but it's details like that contributes heavily towards the end result, right, of the movie. and also, in addition to all of those little things, like there's when they're gathered, the guys, I don't know who they are, investigators, I guess, or
right,
port authority maybe, or I don't know
exactly.
They're investigating the ship log, but if you zoom out, it's a large hall, and like there's a large painting of ships and stuff in the background there. All of that means something. Or like when Hutter's recovering in some convalescent, and there's like, I guess it's like Virgin Mary or something in the painting in the back. Like every little set piece, every picture in Hutter and Ellen's home, there's pictures of them, of one another. And like you could read into that, and they all build into something. You know what I mean? It's just all of that is incredible. There's also a few scenes in there where it's like very similar to Hexen and Silhouette, where there's a bunch of things in the foreground that's shadowy, contrasted against actions in the background, just like some scenes in Hexen. So I just love it. There's just so much to it. Like even when towards the end, Nock was being chased around by the violent mob,
right?
Who is interesting because it's like, wow, who's the predator and prey now? And they're violently tearing the scarecrow apart.
That scene reminded me of a scene in the musical Oliver, when they're chasing Bill Sykes.
Right.
Another thing I thought was interesting was this is sort of like off topic as well, a little bit, but that it really was interesting to me that when I found that his name was Count Orlok, I didn't remember that from when I was a kid, and this is the first time I've watched it since I was a kid. And when I saw Count Orlok and I saw his character, the first thing that came to mind was Jim Carrey's role as Count Olaf in Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events.
Oh yeah.
And I thought, wow, I could really see Jim Carrey doing that role with Orlok as his inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the name was so similar, Count Olaf, Count Orlok.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe I'm reaching there.
One final thing. I mean, I wrote way more than this, but we'll probably wrap it up soon. But there's the last thing I have, which is I don't understand how Ellen knew Bulwer, like the Van Helsing character. There's a few pieces of the relationships in various.
That's missing.
Yeah, like how do
Well,
they kind of know
wasn't
each other?
Wasn't it him that gave him that elderly advice, that spot of wisdom, when he says, "Don't worry so much. You're young. Take life as it comes."
But that was to Hutter, but not to Ellen.
That was
right?
to Hutter.
Right.
But it sort of leads you to understand that if he knows Hutter, he'll know his wife.
I suppose.
So it shows that there's a relationship there.
Wow, it just wasn't very super clear, is all.
Right. It isn't. It isn't. But it is sort of alluded to that they know each other.
Well, I only wrote that because when at the very end scene where Orlok was coming for Ellen, she was asking Hutter to go get the professor.
Right.
And I'm just like, how do they? I didn't get that point of plot where they know each other enough to be like Ellen asking Hutter to go get that professor.
Right. You're right.
That's
It
why
wasn't
I wrote that
detailed.
down. Yeah, it was like I don't know what that connection is, but it probably, like you were saying, probably presupposes some of those other details of things. But any other thoughts? I know I've been talking a lot.
No, it's
No
that's
problem
about
at
all the
all.
thoughts I have on it.
I mean, I absolutely, if you can't tell already, I love all of F.W. Murnau's movies, and I don't even think this is his best movie.
Is his name pronounced Murnau? Murnau?
I think it's Murnau. I saw some documentary
Okay.
on.
Murnau.
That's not his real name. It's Plumpton or some Plumpy.
No, that's his theater name.
So he had kind of, I don't know, falling out or not a good relationship with his dad or something growing up, and he ended up basically saying, I'm going to take on a different name, and he took a name of the adjacent town where he grew up. So there is a Murnau, like Germany or something like that. And so he took on that as his, I guess, theater name or whatever, stage name.
Stage name, yeah.
Yeah, because he
Just didn't want to make. He didn't want to make his father's name famous.
Yeah, it was something like that. I don't think there's a lot of details on him specifically.
Yeah.
It in some ways he's kind of a mystery. We know some things about him, but we also don't know a lot about him. Because he died pretty young. He died in an auto accident when he was 42. So he had an interesting trajectory. So he was making movies in Germany and pre-Hitler, but when Hitler and gang started to rise in power was when like a lot of filmmakers, including him, was like, I'm out of here. Mm-hmm. So, and plus Hollywood, of course, was calling everybody, not just him, but many people. And so he was one of the wave of immigrants who immigrated to Hollywood, and he made, of course, later on, Sunrise. You heard of Sunrise?
Sunrise Entertainment, right?
No. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans.
The movie.
The movie.
Oops.
So he, the very first Oscars in 1927-ish, Academy Award, it was, I think, Wings, the movie, won. But they made a special category just for Sunrise, F.W. Murnau, because it was such a groundbreaking movie for that time. And nobody has ever made another category just for a movie like that ever since, I think.
Really?
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, if you look at the Oscars, they made a...
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, they created a category called unique and artistic picture at the first Academy Awards in 1929.
Wow.
So, and nobody's ever made a unique category just for a movie ever since. They made a category just for the movie Sunrise because it's so powerful. Yeah. That's his claim to fame. A lot of people know him through that and Nosferatu both. But he's made so many other movies. But towards the end of his life, he traveled to, I think it was...
Best unique and artistic.
Yeah, so Tahiti or something. He made his documentary called Taboo, which I saw. And when that movie was about to debut in Hollywood, he died in a car crash. So that's where he died.
Wow. Well, that's some great trivia there.
Yeah, and if he had lived on, I don't know, he would have been one of the greats, I'm sure, like Ernst Lubitsch or Preston Sturges, any number of those immigrants who, immigrated over and made an incredible name for themselves afterwards. I am sure, but such is life. But yeah, so, yeah, I mean, after I remember one of my favorite directors, if not the favorite director, I don't really know if I can say that. I mean, it's really hard to say favorites because when you watch so many movies, who is the favorite, right? So, but he's up there for me, for sure.
You have to have several. You can't say one.
Yeah, but sometimes you just like an era, you know? Like, I feel like the people who love to watch movies the most just tends to like eras of movies. They don't necessarily have like a, they might, but it's hard to pick one, right? So
it is.
Anyway. Mm-hmm. All right, folks. Any parting thoughts on Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror, before we
see it?
Yeah, see it.
It's a cult classic.
Love it. Analyze it. I don't think it's called classic anymore because it's such a monumental cultural influence, I think, out there.
Yeah.
Like, especially around Halloween.
97% Rotten Tomatoes.
You'll often, like, hear this movie over and over again. So,
its controversy made it popular because it fought against Dracula. Yeah. You like this movie? You'll like Dracula. You like Dracula? You'll like this movie.
Yeah.
The ultimate plug.
Which is funny because it added so much to the mythology itself, right? Not just...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, boy. But, I absolutely love this movie. Highly recommended. If you have a chance, watch it with the...
Don't show it to the little ones.
Yeah, don't show it to the little ones, for sure, yeah. But watch it with the score, the Erman score, for sure. It's an incredible score on top of the amazing movie. He's made his mark on the world. But, so any other parting thoughts before we end the podcast?
Well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Lily, for staying up. I know that you may have to go to bed soon. So
Yep.
All right. So thank you again, everyone, and all listeners for tuning in, as it were. And you can find more of our stuff at watchingsilentfilms.wordpress.com. Again, that's watchingsilentfilms.wordpress.com and all the various socials out there. And are you on any other social media, Bob, yourself?
Facebook?
Well, I just meant like if you have a tweet or something like that.
No.
People like, that's okay. Well, you can find more of our work under the Watching Silent Films organization, I guess. All right, and we'll see you guys again later on for another silent film feature. We don't really know what we're going to do next yet, but we'll hash it out soon. And thanks again, everyone, for listening. And if you can leave a review for the various podcast platform like the Apple Podcast, it would greatly appreciate it. It would help other silent film enthusiasts find us as well. Thanks again, and I'm just going to thank you. Bye-bye.